Dear students, we are ready to welcome you here today. This is our last meeting in this session, and I'm glad to welcome Gийома, the professor Tibергьена, the professor of Glasgow University. Today we will speak about a very important topic. We will speak about the strategies of tourism, of rural tourism, and so on. Gийома, please, we are really glad to welcome you. So pity that this is our last meeting in this half of the year. We are looking forward for your lecture. Please start.
Right. Hello, everyone, and I'm really glad to be back. I hope you had a very good field trip. I heard from Ekaterina that you were spending some time in national reserves, and I think this kind of guest lecture is coming at a very important time, because we kind of spoke about what sustainable tourism was, what the marketing of sustainable tourism implied. But now, I think since you have your field trip, what is really important to mention about is the management strategies and actions for rural tourism. And I mean for rural tourism principally because, tourism happens in rural areas for most of it. When you're talking about national reserves, not always, but I guess for Perm, where you are in the Perm region, that's the case, and for the remaining of the national parks in Russia as well. So essentially, what we're going to talk today about is to evaluate some key issues in sustainable use of countryside recreation. We're going to talk about some knowledge of the main concepts in the management strategies and actions for rural tourism. We're going to look at a couple of case studies for the management strategies of these actions for rural tourism, and we're going to try to understand and utilize some of the models and methods that are used to manage tourism in a sustainable way across different rural case studies, including national parks. And so I think what is really important to start with is to talk about sustainability. This golden word, and golden world, if I may, about what sustainability is all about, and especially the development of recreation in those national parks. And I think what is important here again to mention is that it is a transaction, it is a partnership between visitors, local communities. But also this partnership involves that you maximize the benefits for them, for the demand side, the supply side, but also, and more importantly now, for the environment more and more. Sustainable tourism before COVID-19 was, if you remember, the discussion was all about over-tourism. How can we mitigate the impacts, especially the environmental impacts? So there are lots of different schemes at the international, national, local level that are involving sustainable ways of managing tourism locally and across the region. When we talk about countryside recreation, it is a very diverse and fragmented. What does it mean? It means that there's a lot of different types of tourists who are looking for different things. And you will be surprised, for example, in Scotland, that people who come from the main cities of Glasgow or Edinburgh and who go to the countryside to explore, the country, are not necessarily sustainable tourists. They're not necessarily involved in the understanding of what sustainable tourism is and in their actions on the nature or in the countryside. But the main issue for rural tourism or developing this type of tourism in the countryside is to be attractive. And to be attractive, you need a very good marketing, but you need much more than that. And we'll see a couple of examples. But you also need to take into account the scale and the limits of the environment, of what you can do and what you cannot do. Because you need, of course, to minimize the impacts on the environment. And you need to be able to make a type of tourism that is accessible for everyone. Very often, at least in the countries that I have been to, you know, like New Zealand, for example, ecotourism is a very luxury type of tourism, because you're ending up in areas where you sleep in eco lodges, or when you access, you know, some countryside areas, but it takes a lot of time and money to get there. So ecotourism is not a cheap type of tourism. It's very different maybe to what you can see maybe in your region, in the Perm region, because tourism is mostly developed for local tourists. But then if you want to attract international tourists, then it's another story, because of course these tourists have to come, they have to go through a tourism operator, they need, you know, you need to attract them, and that can be quite of a challenge. Okay, so when we mention developing alternative types of tourism, it's all the types of tourism that we talked about last time. If you remember, we talked about adventure tourism. We talked about, you know, I know from what Ekaterina mentioned that you've got yoga tourism, you've got this immersion into the nature, going back to the nature. And that's in itself a very attractive now type of product. With COVID, again, the challenges are numerous. In Scotland, of course, COVID has impacted drastically the tourism industry. And we're looking at a second summer of staycation, meaning Scottish people traveling in Scotland and not going internationally. And so what kind of impacts does it have? We can talk about that a bit later on. Okay. So when we're talking about countryside stewardship, stewardship means literally the management of the countryside. When you're developing this, you need to look at this kind of, you know, four main areas. The landscape. So what is in the landscape that can be attractive and sold to tourists? Fauna and flora. What is in the wildlife? You know, so how can you protect, improve, develop wildlife habitats? What kind of history is there? So what kind of historical and archaeological sites are there in the countryside that you can use and market? And the one that is often forgotten is access. Because if you want to create opportunities for visitors to enjoy the countryside, you need to be able to provide access. In the region where we are, Dumfries and Galloway, this can be an issue. There's a lot of fantastic areas for adventure tourism, tramping, you know, going into various, you know, very rural and wild areas. But how can you access those areas? And what kind of information is available to access those areas? That's another issue. Okay, so when we're talking about sustainable use of countryside recreation, it's always a balanced relationship between visitors, local communities, and the countryside. And it's heavily dependent on what the government is doing with transport policies. My experience, again, from the post-Soviet Union, and when I was working in Kazakhstan, is a problem of infrastructure development, which the Kazakhstani government is trying to remediate at the moment. They're working a lot on infrastructure development to develop tourism in rural areas. But also, of course, there's a lot of work to do as a tourism manager, especially in sustainable tourism in rural areas, to develop work on the behavior of tourists and how to educate tourists, and how to educate also the ones who are providing the experience. Okay. Now, with very popular areas, and it might not yet be the case for you in Perm, we question really the role of marketing. Before COVID, there was a lot of demarketing. Demarketing literally means less marketing, and because the places were becoming too popular. Okay. Now, one of the big works, of course, is a need for conservation and adaptation, repairing, reinforcing footpath, etc., etc. So we'll see a couple of examples again from New Zealand and Scotland, but conservation is the most important environmental stewardship type of measure to do when you're developing tourism in those areas, and sustainable tourism in particular. One of the first measures that we kind of teach the students about is creating protected areas. Okay, what does it mean? It's an area of land or sea especially dedicated to the protection and maintenance of biological diversity and natural associated cultural resources managed through legal or effective means. So the Yellowstone National Park is world famous, was created in 1872 and was the first one of its kind. Okay, so of course, who is involved? Government agencies and private conservation organizations, who are the most, the most important stakeholders in the management of these protected areas. And when you design protected areas, they're often created where land and water are not seen or useful for agriculture. But there's a lot of question about the size, about minimizing distances for spaces, dispersal, and harmful hedge effects. That means doing an impact assessment of the areas, but also creating vegetation corridors between protected areas for movement. Again, we'll see what it means in an example in Kazakhstan. So the types of protected areas that we have, and that's defined by IUCN, is a range of different types from the most protected ones to the least protected ones, starting with very strict natural reserve, wilderness areas, national parks, as you know, in Russia, natural monument, habitat spaces management area, protected landscape, and managed resource protection areas. Now, I'm going to share another page of what it means. For example, if we're talking about the management of national park from the IUCN, and you've got the link on the slide, okay? So that's the category 2, the national park. What does it mean? So they define it, the primary objective, to protect the natural biodiversity along with its underlying ecological structure and supporting environmental processes, and to promote education and recreation. So you see here, there's a very strong component, like in ecotourism, about education. And if we're looking at the 6 major objectives, I'm not going to read everything, but look at this. Manage the area to perpetuate in as natural a state as possible, representative examples of physiographic regions, biotic communities, genetic resources, and unimpaired natural processes. To maintain a viable and ecological functional population, an assemblage of native spaces and densities sufficient to conserve the ecosystem integrity and resilience. To contribute to conservation of wide-ranging spaces, regional and ecological processes, and migration routes. We'll see an example in Kazakhstan with birds that are migrating, and it's now becoming a bird watching reserve. That's an important part here. To manage visitor use for inspirational, educational, cultural, and recreational purposes at a level which will not cause significant biological, ecological degradation. And then here, there's the bit about the local communities and indigenous people. Okay, so you need to take them into account. You need to consult them when you're developing those protected areas. Okay, and finally, you see that's not the first objective, is to contribute to local economies through tourism. Okay. So the economic impact, of course, is the main benefit for those areas, because all these areas need money. So there's more here that you'll be, I hope, browsing. I'm not going through all of that, but they develop lots of different categories and issues for consideration, and so on and so forth, that you can go through when you're going to have the slides. So I'm going back to the slides now. And you see, we were talking about the national park areas. So that's the link that I just browsed. Okay, so just to show you the different levels of protected areas. If we're looking at national parks in the UK, you see we've got a number of national parks. And the biggest one in the UK is in Scotland. It's called the Cairngorms. And the famous ones are the Lake District ones. And we've got the Loch Lomond and the national parks next to Glasgow that is very famous as well. But you see, in the UK, we've been developing quite a number of national parks. And these two in Scotland are very, very popular, and they're very, very well managed as well. Okay, so that's the managerial consideration for national parks. The other forms of protection, and you need to know that, and this is something really important now in tourism, is UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. Okay, so the UNESCO is protecting World Heritage sites that are naturally or culturally significant. Okay, and if we're looking at one again that I was browsing in Kazakhstan, I'm going to try to. Did you manage to see the previous slides or not? Okay, so I'm going to share another screen with you, which is the Kazakhstan UNESCO Heritage List. Okay, that's the one I was looking for here.
Yes, we have seen the previous slides, but then you changed the screen and
okay.
we started to see only you. But at first we saw some basic ideas.
Okay.
There was a text and everything.
Okay. So this is what the UNESCO is doing. So you see on the World Heritage List, they're having levels of protection. Okay. So this is a site with petroglyph in Kazakhstan. This is an image of the petroglyph within the archaeological landscape of Tamgalitas, it's called. So this is a very famous site in Kazakhstan. They have, I think, 3 or 4 UNESCO heritage sites that are protected. Okay. When you've got a site that has this level of protection, that gives not only a protection for the site itself, but that also gives funding for the management of the area, including, fences, visitor management, such as having rangers that are paid on the site to protect the site themselves. That also involves, rangers giving some educational aspect on the site and making sure that visitors have the proper code of conduct on the site, etc., etc. So UNESCO has a very important role to play on this. So going back to the slides, that's another level of protection, if you wish. The third level of protection is called Ramsar site. Okay, and that's very important as well. It's an international convention. And to be able to have this level of protection, the site must contain a unique and rare wetland type of or internationally important biodiversity. And if I share again another very interesting site for Ramsar, and I just made a very kind of, simple exercise. Kazakhstan again, and we've got one very close to where I am based now in Scotland. Ramsar is an international convention that protects the biodiversity. That site in Kazakhstan, and you see the new capital Nur-Sultan is here. It's a couple of hours from Nur-Sultan. It's called Korgalzhin Birdwatching Reserve, lake system, literally. Okay, it's a nature reserve, and it's located next to Tengiz Lakes. And what is unique there is they have the most amazing bird migrations. In one of the top, Kazakhstan is one of the top 5 bird watching reserve on Earth, because they've got, for example, pink flamingos migrating there. every year. And so it's been a strict nature reserve since 1968. And what they are looking for here, so you see here, they have the colony of the greater flamingo. They have colonies of Dalmatian pelicans. They have over 500 breeding pairs of, of these kind of birds and so on. They have special ducks. They have up to 4,000 birds, out of 30 to 40% of the world population. So it's a very, very important place. And it's also a place that has a number of other international organizations involved in the protection. When you've got this kind of protection, so again, it's been a Ramsar site since 2007. Okay, that means that you can't do anything you want on the area, and I'm going to come back to this very quickly now. What you cannot do is develop any form of tourism the way you want it to be. There are some very specific rules. Areas that you can access, areas that you can't access. So this is an example of Korgalzhin lake system. Okay, this is a map that is taken from the Ramsar site. I've got lots of friends who are involved in birdwatching tourism in this area. Okay, just to provide you with a perspective, this is an area in Kazakhstan where you've got the biggest bird aficionados in the world coming to this area to observe those pink flamingos or pelicans or other bird types. But you see here, you see the Korgalzhin Reserve in pink. And then you've got the lakes, Tengiz Lakes. So that's why it's called a Tengiz Lake Systems, because you've got several lakes. And around those lakes, you've got what we call a buffer zone, which is an area that you can't access. So that delimits the areas that you can access. But on those nature reserves, of course, a lot of people wanted to develop tourism. And they wanted to develop specifically birdwatching tourism. So the way you're doing this, and this is something that is, for example, one tour operator in Kazakhstan. So they wanted to have some specific segments. Okay, so what they call bird watchers. I think it's quite self-explanatory, a group of foreign tourists. But they have also a lot of what they call scientific tourism. So it's got lots of schools coming from Nur Sultan on the site, doing a lot of educational type of tourism to get an excursions on within the Biosphere Reserve. And they've got, and that's pretty new, that's Astana is now Nur Sultan. They've got, since last year, they have what they call familiarization tourism, mostly for any local tourist, but also they want to develop recreational tourism for families and for, combining picnics, trips, camping sites and amateur fishing. But when you've got a site like this that is really, really unique and protected internationally, you need to think twice about the number of tourists that you want to bring there, the type of infrastructure that you want to develop there, the type of code of conduct that you want to have on site, etc., etc. Okay, so to do that, there's a lot of consulting companies that are doing this. For example, doing ecological surveys and assessments, habitat design, visitor center planning and design, wetland treatment and sustainable drainage, interpretation and landscape design. And you've got a link there. But to be able to do that, because we've got, for example, a Ramsar site very close to where the University of Glasgow is located. We've got some very interesting prospects to develop some best practice in those areas like Korgalzhin. If we have time, we can have a look at an example. Now, the other type of protected areas that exist called Biosphere Reserves. Okay? And it's also a UNESCO type of Biosphere Reserve since 1971, has three main functions, okay? Conservation, landscape, ecosystem, development, logistics, okay? And we've got actually one in Dumfries and Galloway, where we are located, and I can show it to you on the site itself. And what this place is doing is, hang on. So where is it? Biosphere Reserve. Yes, Galloway Forest Park, it's called. So I'm going to share my screen again. Yes, so this is the Galloway Forest Park that we have here. Sorry. No, I'm just going to go back to this link. 1 second. Yeah. So here we go. Yeah, sorry. So the Biosphere Reserve that exists, here we go, is actually the first one to be recognized as a world leader at a major UN Congress in Scotland. Okay. And that's located where a little bit above where we are. Okay. And what it does, again, it is, making sure of applying the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and capturing really the essence of, what the biosphere is doing in terms of protection of the fauna and the flora and developing sustainable enterprises and sustainable forms of tourism onto the area. Okay, so you've got also the link on the Biosphere Reserve for you. Having said that, all right. Oh. So when we're looking at the Southern Galloway Ayrshire Reserve, this is a quite exciting type of international certification, if you wish, because it also provides a lot of funding. So for UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, there's at the moment, for example, over there, there's a whole visitor management team in place and developing trails, making sure that when the trails are developed, again, the codes of conduct are ensured, and they're also doing a lot of marketing on the top. So we'll come back to this a bit later. Now, all the forms of recreation that you can develop in rural areas. Oops, there's a chat. Yeah, I'll get back to your question, Irina. We're developing also what we call green belts. So when you think about rural areas, as soon as you are around a city, what can you do really to develop rural tourism in those areas? Okay, so arranging rangers, subsidized transport, and information center, of course, are quite important. But as I said before, the multi-stakeholder approach is very key. And non-governmental organizations are very often involved in the sustainability and the management of the sites. It's just to show you here so we had the first international ecotourism conference in Kazakhstan happened in 2010, and I was there. And you see, in Kazakhstan, this is a tour operator. This is the European Union. This is the UNDP. So they have grants that they're giving to develop those areas. This is an NGO. This is a German NGO. This is Eco Museum Karaganda, which is a local NGO. and this is the name of the project. What I just want to show you is, as soon as you're developing those sustainable approaches, you need collaboration. You can work on your own local level, regional level, and at the national level with the Russian government, but you need also international expertise from those international agencies, okay? And if you really want to develop, national parks and trails and routes, and diversify the rural countryside for tourism, you need to have all these kind of developments and expertise from overseas, okay? So now I'm going to go back to your question, Irina, before I move any far forward. So, what do you think is the main problem of introducing European innovations into tourism in Russia? Are there any factors preventing this? That's a good question. Can I ask you maybe to specify your question more in particular? What do you mean by innovation in tourism?
Irina, can you pronounce it, please? Your vision of innovations.
What do you mean exactly by European innovation? From what you have? The thing is, is your question about what you don't have yet, or is it from, question about diversifying your type of tourism, or from what you currently developing? If you can specify.
I guess maybe there are some problems with connections. Sometimes it happens. Oh, no, there is an answer here.
So, for example, tourism applications, virtual tourism.
Mm-hmm.
But do you mean types of tourism that do you mean in rural areas, in the countryside, or in the cities?
I think both. In general, probably.
This is a very broad question, it's very hard to answer, because if your question was about a specific area, we could look at the specific area together and look at what you're doing right now and what could be done, doing a form of assessment, if you wish. From what I know from Perm region, okay, from what Ekaterina was developing earlier on, I think the form of tourism that you have right now is very interesting, because it's based on a post-COVID world, okay? Meaning, bringing visitors to rural areas. What I think you don't have is all the things that I just mentioned. International conventions protecting those national parks, working on, what we call carrying capacities. So how many tourists can you bring to the area, maximum numbers, without deteriorating the environment? What sort of interpretation of information can you provide on the area? What sort of codes of conduct you need to develop to protect those areas? So when visitors come, you need to, if I may say so, educate them. What sorts of codes of conduct do you have there? But I would say, if I can keep going on the lecture, because I think your question is very much based on what I'm going also to talk about right now, is what we call the types of tourists, okay? And I know Ekaterina was also interested to work on segmentation, who are these tourists?
Yeah, exactly.
To these areas. And this is what we talked about in marketing and segmentation strategies, because if we look at the average tourist going to those areas, as I said, in New Zealand, these people are quite wealthy. You need to have money to be able to go and take your car and visit a national park. It's not cheap. In the UK or in Scotland where we are, it's a bit more affordable, if I may say so, but it's still, you know, mostly for middle class here. So, but also, you know, if you want to pay for an exclusive experience, you know, what I mean by exclusive, I can tell you in Kazakhstan, you had people who were ready to pay something like 2,000 to 3,000 euros for 2 weeks of holidays in Kazakhstan in different rural areas with a private guide who was able to explain all the historical backgrounds, all the different specificities of the steppe landscapes with fauna and flora just for them. And I'm talking about, it was a couple of, you know, we're talking about a tour for between 2 and 5 people. So what you need is experts who are ready to do this. But you need also to be able to assess what people are really wanting. The tourists that I just mentioned, the ones that are ready to pay a lot of money to do that, they want a very high level of detail about the areas. They don't want to have a group tour in a bus, you know, where tourists are, you know, left on the visitor center and then they take another bus to another area. What they want is really a customized tour. They want to be the one and only in the area. And I think again, what is missing in your country, in for Russia and especially the Perm region, I think is really doing much more research on to what the demand is asking and uh, what what the local areas have to really offer. What is the uniqueness? You know, is the very often in the countryside, the uniqueness is about the type of animals that you can see. I mentioned about Kazakhstan, but I will mention another example about New Zealand very shortly. In Scotland, the uniqueness is a mix of what we call built heritage, the castles, and all the amazing fauna and flora, flowers, trees, and the types of birds we have. So last weekend, I just came back from a national reserve where they had unique birds as well. So it was, again, very well protected because you couldn't, you know, you couldn't leave your litter, for example. They had very specific rules onto the area. So I think that what is missing, and it was largely the case in Kazakhstan, so what I mean in all those post-Soviet Union type of countries, and for the Russian Federation, I think it's pretty much the case, you need more expertise to do that. And if we're looking at visitor management, as I mentioned, there's a lot about influencing the visitor behavior and attitude towards the environment. And there's a lot of work to do on making people aware of conservation issues and as to respect and contribute to the environment. So you need codes of conduct and guidelines, okay? This is an example. In general terms, of course, it's adapted very specifically on different areas. But you see, there's a code of conduct in terms of behavior, fire, gates, dogs, public path, fences, edges, walls, livestock, crops, machinery, litter, so garbage, how to keep water clean, protect wildlife, plants and trees, and take special care on the country roads, and noise levels. Okay, so for all of these things, you've got specific guidelines. And so when you're talking about management consideration, there's a lot of things to take into account. I mentioned carrying capacities, but also the pricing schemes. Okay, so how can you make sure that the area that you work on has tourists all year long? And of course, there's a lot of work to do on development of the attractions from crafts workshops or creating a different level of service. Okay, so we've got all of that, for example, across different national parks in the UK, and even the one that I just mentioned in Krogarjin in Kazakhstan. Okay, so whether you want to control visitors in terms of roads and trails and resorts and lodges, there's a lot of work if you want to welcome visitors on site to develop ways to accommodate those visitors. Eco-lodges, for example. You also need to work on visitor safety and alternative types of transports. So public transportation, for example. Okay. So an example that I have for you guys is an island in New Zealand that I've been to. And I think they're doing an amazing job. It's back to the Department of Conservation in New Zealand. And the Department of Conservation is managing a lot of the wilderness areas in New Zealand. And they're doing, you know, development of trails and tracks. So you see here, the red track here is called the coastal track. And they've got another type of track here. And every track has different specificities in terms of what you can see, the type of fauna and flora that you can see more specifically. But they also have what they call a headland heritage track around here. And what is really interesting, I find, in this island is that, so this is where the boat is landing here, and this is where the campsite is. Okay, so the campsite is in a very specific area of the island. You see in the very corner of this island. And all the different tracks here are managed so that the native vegetation that you can see, so there's also a blue track here, is preserved. But also you've got countryside rangers on the island that are welcoming you across different points. But also you've got an information, toilets. The information center is here, but you've got various areas for toilets built and picnics areas. Okay, but you can see here that you can't picnic anywhere here. You've got to picnic next to where the campsite is. Okay, so all the management of this island is made so that the tourists and all the litter is managed here in those, with the litter that you have to take back home as well. Okay, you can't leave anything on the island. So, and they've got a fantastic beach here. So people go for recreation to spend some time next to the ocean, but they also go there to see very rare bird species. And it's done all together in one shot. So if I go onto the website of the Department of Conservation, I think I uploaded it for you. Yes, that's here. That's a fantastic area for, fantastic website, really, to look at what the Department of Conservation is doing. This is a picture of the island. You see this beautiful landscape, okay? And so they've got this map here, so you can see that Auckland town is here. So you take a boat from here to go to the island here. So they've got various categories and access and landscape. They've got, you see, 48 non-powered 10. That means there's no electricity there. So the infrastructure is minimal. They've got seasonal restrictions. They've got no fires, so no dogs. They've got all sorts of different certifications as well. So, without going too much into details, you can of course go online and and look at various, regulations. But what I want to tell you here is the most important is to have some form of management and regulations, whether local or whether international. Okay, so I'm going back to the presentation now. So that's an example from New Zealand. Okay, so what you have to take into account as well in terms of site management is built accommodation. As I said, locating facilities. So are you allowing only tents, or are you building some camper van facilities? Are you building what we call, eco lodges? How do you manage rivers, banks, and lakes and coastlines around the lakes? And how do you manage the seeding and the planting for regeneration once you've got tourism being developed there? Okay. And of course, one of the key questions, it's always one of the most important questions, is how much money can you ask for that? So pricing in the UK with Department of Conservation, sorry, in New Zealand with Department of Conservation, or in the UK with various schemes that we have, the pricing is used for the conservation and maintenance of the countryside, whether it's the erosion of footpath, pollution, litter, damage to fauna and flora, the countryside rangers, and the management of CO2 emissions offsetting. And with the real question being, can it be free? And of course not, unless it's a recreational area that is designed to be free. So there's really something to think about here in terms of pricing. So are you putting a tax on conservation? And are you paying, or are you asking for money because you need to advertise your site in terms of visitor behavior, or in terms of managing zoning? So zoning means zoning different areas for to protect them. Or are you using money to develop car parks, issuing time tickets or guided tours, or developing a website where you can do advanced bookings? Okay. With, and I think this is very important, restricting and regulate car access, because one of the key issue in all the places I've been to is, one, infrastructure development, but also people take their own cars to go and access those places, and it's not sustainable. So there's a lot of different ideas and schemes that are being developed around this, such as park and ride schemes, road tolls, building bypasses, more car parks, but more importantly, I would say, alternative transportation, trains, buses, public transports. But they need to be subsidized by the local council. The other aspect, besides pricing, to think about is the provision of information. Information points, display boards, maps, and signs. And this is a lot of work. And this is usually done, I know, at least in Kazakhstan, by really ecotourism enthusiasts. All the information I've seen in this country were provided by the local teams of scientists. But there was very little collaboration between the government and the local enthusiasts. What I call local enthusiasts is really the local scientists. And again, there are international expertise for that and international benchmarking for that. And why I talk about this, because interpretation is very much key to educate tourists and provide information, especially for schools. And it's important because it influences visitors' opinions. It's also a good way to get responses from visitors. And it's one of the only ways, really, to develop historical, geographical, geological, wildlife, and human characteristics types of information. And a lot of different ways can be used, such as providing guided nature walks, printed information, listening posts. There's a lot of interpretive displays and live performances as well. I've seen a lot of that in Kazakhstan, for example. So to get back to your question, Irina, about Russia, I think a lot of what is missing as well is online interpretation types of information. A lot of the QR code / testimonial / podcast / as simple as a good website with very detailed information onto the areas. Okay. So one way to provide this is the rangers, because the rangers can not only enforce the laws on the interior, but they also repair work, footpath, and so on, and are responsible for the general site management. So they make sure that the visitors are having a good time, and they protect them, but also, make sure that they protect the areas from inappropriate behavior from the visitors. But I would say, personally, my experience with countryside rangers is the level of information they can provide onto fauna and flora onto the local areas. That is quite unique, especially that was the case in New Zealand and in Scotland as well. And so when we're looking at the marketing and information, as you probably know, this is one of the key issues and also key problem to attract visitors. If you don't have any information, you can't really attract anyone. But I would say the other advantage is how you can influence the type of tourism that are coming. I would say, if I take my own case, I'm a typical visitor for those kind of rural areas because I'm interested into the wilderness. But so as soon as I find very relevant information, very precise information, I'm browsing the website, and I'm trying to take any information I can use to book my trip. And I've seen a little bit, but not extensive type of information for Perm, for example. The last type of information I want to talk about is zoning. So zoning is recognizing smaller units. Okay, so with prescribed level of protection. So it protects natural environments, but it is usually happening in wild areas, remote areas of highest intensity recreation use. And you've got different sorts of zoning, such as time zoning. So, what I found very interesting as well is how can you spread tourists onto an area with time tickets? So you're allowing a group of a certain number of tourists for a limited time, and then you can make sure that you don't overflow the type of tourist onto the areas. Okay. Now, the last element I wanted to talk about is the local and international accreditation. But before doing that, do you have any questions? Because this is quite a big part with the international accreditation and certification.
Dear students, do you have any questions? I have a comment, actually. I think that in most cases, we particularly lack the strategy of development of tourism. I mean, when we compare Russia and some foreign cases, just my comments, but it's the opinion of many experts in tourism in Russia. We lack strategy, first of all.
So what do you mean? What do you mean by strategy exactly?
In many cases, all the development of the tourism is actually, let us say, is looked at as local cases with not thinking where to develop further, what to do in 10 or 20 years, or not thinking about the perspective of development. It's like you're in a fire, you have some things that to do immediately, but quite often the roadmap and the strategy is not written properly and is not thought of particularly properly.
Yes. And this is very much linked to what I just explained, you know, having
Yeah,
all these stakeholders in one room
yeah,
and actually devising of and a good strategy always comes from research. You can't have a strategy if you haven't assessed the supply side, what the area has to offer, who are the main actors in those areas. Because
yeah.
very often, you know, like if I take Kazakhstan, uh, you know, everything was decided on the top level. So the government was saying, well, we need to build a 200 yurt camp on the border of that lake. But there was no consultation with the local communities. There was no consultation with the local non-governmental organizations. There was no consultation with the tourists. There was no consultation, especially at the local level. There was no consultation with the tourism operators that are already working in this area and already know what the tourists are looking for. And so a good a good strategy is always starting by what we call a multi-stakeholder approach. You put all the stakeholders in a room and you start to do focus group and you start to interview them and you start to say, okay, so what are you looking for? What do you really want to see there? And what you're describing, Katja, is really what we call an immediate short-term vision.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
uh, you've got people who are saying, this is what we have, let's make money very quickly.
Yeah,
And this is happening in so many countries around the world, because very often the people who have those unique places want to maximize the benefits,
mhm.
and by doing so they market their place not in a sustainable way. Okay, so they bring, for example, a lot of tourists in one time. They don't have any particular facilities. So you know, you need to really look at international standards as well. You know, the sustainability of those places is managed well when you also have international organizations involved and funding.
Yeah,
uh, and international protection levels like the ones I just mentioned. Biosphere reserves, protected areas, UNESCO, you know, certification, and so on and so forth. All of that takes a lot of time. You know, it doesn't happen in a day. It's um, it's putting a team in place as well. You know, you've got not only people from the government, but also at the regional level, at the perm regional level, you need to have these people involved with you, because the funding, from my experience with the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union, is the funding comes from the state. If you don't have that money, you can't really do much, unfortunately.
yeah, that's true.
So, any other questions? I think it's a fundamental point, Katja, that you're making. Um, there's a lack of vision and a lack of cooperation, I think.
Yeah. Okay, dear students, maybe you have some questions you would like to ask. If you hesitate to ask, you can write them in a chat. And if you're shy to pronounce, you can write it in a chat. Please, you're welcome to ask. Not yet, I guess.
Okay, so
But I
what I would,
know they discussed before the lecture that they are preparing some questions for you. So I guess
sure.
be at the end of the lecture, probably.
Okay, I'm done very soon with one aspect. I just want to go through one more set quickly on slides on eco certification, and then we can have a quick pause, 10 minutes, and then we can go for questions. Okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to start with a video because I think that's something that could be really useful for see what we have here in the UK called the Ecotourism Green Tourism Business Scheme. But to do that, I need to allow the share the sound. Okay, I think that's gonna work. Okay, so it's called the Green Tourism Scheme.
Increasingly, good green credentials are important for business, whether it's a single customer looking for a B&B or a multinational organisation arranging a conference venue. How can being a member of the Green Tourism Business Scheme make a difference when it comes to marketing? Let's find out.
Businesses use the Green Tourism logo in lots of ways to get out to their consumers for marketing purposes, using it on their website, using it in their literature. Actually, we've got a considerable growing number of businesses now that are getting business just because of their Green Tourism Business Scheme. So actually hotel chains now that are joining because they need to have a third-party certified grading, because their customers like PricewaterhouseCoopers and people, the government agencies, are now insisting that they have that kind of commitment. In terms of what businesses can actually get out of the scheme, it's really unlimited. It really is their own imagination, if you like. There's some fantastic examples of what businesses have done to get across the message to their consumer, whether it's providing a picnic wheelbarrow so that they stay in the grounds and have a picnic rather than driving the car somewhere, or perhaps a hotel with a spa has a discount if you leave your car keys with them for the week. Then you get 10% off your stay at the thing. So there's really no limit to what businesses can get out of it, and there's fantastic innovation in the way that businesses have used their grading.
Increasingly, a lot of corporations and larger businesses have corporate social responsibilities and sustainable purchasing programs, and which means when they approach conference centres, event venues or hotels to work with them, they will ask for their environmental policies and what these sites, and in this instance our members, have done for their social and environmental responsibility. Many members report that in those instances it's an excellent way of credibly and simply demonstrating what they have done by letting them know that they are members of Green Tourism.
The principle of the Green Tourism Business Scheme in terms of its levels, bronze, silver and gold, is also about continual improvement. So we revisit the businesses every 2 years to make sure they're still maintaining their standard, and also to give them more advice on new technologies and things like that. But we're looking for them to continually improve. The criteria itself is it's also continually being updated. So we relaunch our criteria about once every 3 to 4 years. That includes new technologies, new innovation, maybe new legislation that's coming along that we can inform businesses about. So we're continually moving the goalposts, if you like, for businesses, but helping them on the way. So we've got advice and got information and fact sheets so that they're supported through the process.
Many of our members are very proud to be in Green Tourism and really do see it as a badge of honour that they have achieved their award level and can promote that to the consumers. I think increasingly consumers are very aware and do really want businesses to take responsibility and address those environmental impact issues. Maybe it's not something they want to worry about on holiday as a consumer, but it does add value that they know the business has addressed it and is taking care of it for them, really.
Green Tourism Business Scheme, in terms of future, I think what we're seeing in the industry at the moment and within consumers' actions is an acceptance of green measures, an acceptance of green grading, and actually a demand for it. And it's been fairly recently, the last 2 or 3 years only, that's sort of really coming to the fore. And I think what we're seeing now is it's almost like a must-have. In the past, it was like a nice to have, or, I'm doing it, I would like to get my green badge. But now it's actually, I need to be doing this because this is what my guests want. So we will continue to develop, to improve, to provide business benefits, to improve the profile of green tourism so that more and more businesses can benefit from it.
So essentially what this video is saying is, and that's the Green Tourism Business Scheme. So this is a very popular certification scheme for sustainability here. And this is a summary of what this scheme is doing. So they comply with environmental legislation. So they continuously work on the impact, really, that hotels, for example, have on the environment. So they have to demonstrate good environmental management at a number of levels, okay, in terms of energy use, for example, water use, but also how they recycle their purchase, how they manage waste, okay, glass, paper, car, plastic, metal, how they manage transport, minimizing visitors' car use by promoting local and national public transport, cycle hire, local walking and cycling options, and the use of alternative fuels. On-site measures to increase biodiversity, wildlife gardening, growing native spaces, nesting boxes, and information on the wildlife and around the site for visitors. So you see here, the scheme acts as a marketing tool, as the person was explaining in the video. Clearly, more and more visitors, and it's the case in the UK and across really around the world, when you've got this GTPS gold medal, if you wish, that's a certification that works as a branding, but also that makes sure for visitors that you are following the appropriate measures, environmental measures in particular. Okay, so all these eco certification, so the GTPS is one, that's the biggest one in the UK, really encourage best practice. Okay, and there's, as we talked before, a number of different schemes, but the one here is very important, again, to protect those areas, at least in the UK. Okay, so what you need to do in terms of strategy, and going back to Ekaterina's comment, okay, is choosing the appropriate management action. First of all, to do an assessment of impacts. Evaluate how well the site is in terms of numbers of visitors they can access. Increase education and communication. The development of the site itself, and what kind of levels of protection do you want to have? How much will it cost? And what kind of approach do you want to have in terms of zoning, site design, regulating visitors, and education? So when you're planning sustainable places, you need to work with public policy and, of course, the government. But you also need to share good practice between the people who plan and the people who manage the local areas, because very often, and I don't know if it's the case in Perm because I have never been there, but do you have local communities that are not satisfied? And there's a lot of that, more and more, including in Scotland, with areas that are not made sustainable because there's no planning and there's no vision. And so these walkable and cycling environments are two different sorts of tourism that are worked on very closely in Scotland at the moment. The region where we are, Dumfries and Galloway, they try to develop cyclotourism a lot, okay? And walking tourism. So that was what I wanted to tell you to start with. It's been a little bit long, but all these, I hope it gave you a little bit of additional perspective from your field trip, just to think about. Katya, what do you think is better? Do you want to take questions now, or do you want to have a small kind of coffee break, or kind of and then we can go for questions?
I think coffee break will be quite good.
Yes.
Because
Okay.
after that, maybe students will prepare some questions. Dear students, I have a task for you. Please think over and try to ask questions, because this is the unique opportunity to ask questions about the problems you would like to discuss. So for how much time we will make a break? For 10 minutes or more?
Yeah, we can take a 10 minutes break and come back in 5 minutes before. That would be what time at your place?
Yeah, it will be. So here we have some students from Moscow University, so it's better to pronounce minutes. So now it's 43 minutes. So I suggest to meet at 55 if you
Okay.
don't mind. Yes,
55.
because we have some students from Moscow campus of High School of Economics, and that's why for them the time is different as well.
Okay, no problem.
Yep. Okay, dear students, let's meet in 10 minutes, in 55 minutes.
Okay.
Now,
See you soon.
I'll see you soon. 10 minutes break. I'm back. What about the others? Are you back?
Hello, everyone.
Hello, we are here. I know that Stanislav.
How's everything going? Are you back?
Yeah, we are back.
From your pause. Can take a couple of minutes more if needed.
No, I think we shall continue better. I know that Stanislav has some questions he would like to ask you.
Yes, I would like to ask a question about this lecture. You previously said about protected areas and how.
Katya, you here?
Yeah, you can't hear us.
Can you hear me?
I guess no. Can you hear us?
I can't hear much. I don't know if there's a connection issue or. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, now I can. Yeah.
Can
Hello?
you hear us?
Yes, perfect.
Oh,
Yes.
great. That's good because Stanislav started asking a question.
Okay.
And then you realize that you can't hear us. And now you can hear us. Everything is good, yes?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes,
Stanislav,
Giyom, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Yes. In this lecture, you said about protected areas, and I have a question. Well, who should work with these areas? Is it some government organization or tourism operators who are most interested organization in this development of areas?
Yes, it really depends on what you want to do. Can you give me a specific example? Like what sort of protection do you want to have and for what?
Like national parks?
Well, the national parks, really, who is involved in this is the governmental authorities. But again, it depends on, how, who are already working in those places. How many rangers do you have on site? Who, I mean, if you look at all the stakeholders groups, you've got the governmental officials working there, but tour operators are selling those places, so they are useful just to assess the visitor demand and just to work with the demand side. So they're traditionally not really involved with these levels of protection. What I meant before is to have them in a room just to know what is needed to be protected. So somehow they can provide some information about how visitors are behaving, what they're really looking for. So that's then useful to use for the national parks to develop interpretation boards of information. But really, how the government at the national, the regional, and the local level work, sometimes with international organizations, to develop that. So if we look at Kazakhstan, as I said, this Kolgarjin natural reserve worked with Ramsar, which is an international convention protection. And you've got experts from Ramsar coming on the site and doing all sorts of evaluation of impacts and producing a very detailed report. And from that report, they can say, well, this is your buffer zone. This area needs no access to visitors. This area needs that. So it's a specific example there. If you look at, I mean, my experience for Kazakhstan is a lot of non-governmental organizations are also involved in those protected areas designations. And so if we look at how ecotourism was developed in Kazakhstan, the European Union funded the whole project. The UNDP was involved. The NABU, which is the main German non-governmental organization for the protection of biodiversity, was involved. And you had local actors such as Ecomuseum Karaganda, which is one of the main point of contact, if you wish, for all these, what I call the, enthusiasts, all these people, this very high-level scientists who have the expertise of the local ground, but who don't really know what to do with this expertise, if I may say so. What I mean by that is, of course, they know what they're doing, but at some level, they need to have this expertise taken forward by a bigger entity, so that this knowledge can be used more at the national and at the international level. And if you don't have those different layers, then that's when the problems become more apparent, because then it's only about what is done at the local level and no one is checking what is being done. Whereas when you've got different layers, then you can say, well, actually, you cannot do that because in this planning, then, this area has a specific designation protection. And so this is the roadmap to follow. And if you don't do that, then you are breaking the rules, and then what you're doing is illegal. What I didn't mention, though, and I know it is a kind of a specific issue, I would say, is unfortunately if I take, for example, Kazakhstan, there's a lot of illegal activities happening, a lot of corruption as well. How you manage that, that's a very difficult question. What I mean by that, for example, is you've got very rare birds or rare species of animals in Kazakhstan, and you've got a lot of illegal hunting. Who are these people coming for illegal hunting? Lots of foreigners, actually. And why? So even in protected areas, if you are bypassing the law, then you can start being able to do that. Why it's happening? Because the local rangers are not making enough money. So there's a whole ripple effect from how the state is making sure that the local rangers have enough money to protect these areas, and so they are not involved in other types of activities. Of course, what I'm saying now is there's no proof of that. But it is a rampant problem across the board. It's not only in the post-Soviet Union countries, it's in many more countries, in Southeast Asia as well. So the main idea with protection is actually to protect the endangered species. And the best level of protection I know of personally is those international levels beyond the national levels. I don't know if did I answer your questions?
Yes, absolutely. And I also have another question. You spoke about different segments, and especially about ecotourism, who spend a lot of money on visiting concrete regions. And what entity or organization or tour operators should influence government to adjust how many people can visit protected areas? For example, if one national park can its capacity around 400 people per year, and the wanted people who want to visit this national park are much more, for example, 2,000 people,
Mhm.
who should initiate the
Well,
this
it's part of
question?
the visitor management. It's a very good question. And the answer to that question is, again, research. And it's research made by, scientists, mostly, on the fauna, on the flora, to really evaluate the impact of 400 people. So is it 400 people in a day, or is it 400 people? Is
In a
it
year?
in a year, right? So, I can give you an example of New Zealand. New Zealand has, in the South Island, they have very, very important areas where they develop trekking, and they have some of the most beautiful treks on the planet. And it's called carrying capacity. So they limit the number of people who can visit the area per year. And the way they do this is they have a lot of what we call impact assessment. So they have, and I am not a scientist, so I can't do this research, but they are able to tell very, very precisely, how many people can be into an area without damaging the environment. Okay, and it's a lot of cited elements such as coastal pathways, mitigation, erosion, impact on the environment in terms of measuring the bird, the animal species onto the ground, and having other types of mitigation strategies for people who are on the spot, trying to mitigate and trying to ensure the impacts. Sorry, I've got 1 second. I've got someone here. Just 1 second. So the carrying capacities are calculated by scientists in cooperation with, for example, Department of Conservation, who are in New Zealand, who are able to say, this is what is needed here, this is what is needed there. And it's different in various countries. What is super important, though, is to have people who can really calculate those impacts. Visitor management is then put in place from those reports. Okay, so from saying, you can have a maximum of 400 people, and then you can have a maximum of 1,000 people, and so on and so forth. So it's a mix of different reports from different agencies who can calculate that. My experience with sites that have really done a good job is, for example, Department of Conservation in New Zealand, and the national parks that we have also in the UK on this, because they, when they develop, for example, a campsite like the one I showed you on the island, they calculate, when they say 48 tents, it's because they have calculated that in that specific area, from the land that is available, they can put a maximum of 48, and that means X number of people. More people will make more erosion on the path, means they will need to pay for more rangers, and they will need to have more people to actually mitigate all these impacts. So there is clearly a ripple effect on how many people you can accommodate into an area. And it's based on the site specificities, and every site is different. So in Kazakhstan, those impacts are calculated by those special NGOs on the ground, because they are the only ones who have access to the data. But very quickly, then you need those international experts coming in onto the site, because they have the raw data, but they don't really know what to do with them. So they work in cooperation with those international organizations. or consultancy, like the one I showed you from the WTTC that was into the slide. They do also doing crossover consultancy between similar sites. So Ramsar sites or sites that are about to be designated as Ramsar sites or UNESCO sites as well. UNESCO is a much more complicated procedure as well. And so it's very technical to gain those very special labeling of various, type of certification. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, maybe some other questions. Dear students, do you have some other questions? If yes, please ask.
Hello. I would like to ask which nature reserve do you remember the most and why?
I've got extremely good souvenirs from the ones in Scotland, because whether the Cairngorms National Park or the Loch Lomond National Park, because first of all, the sceneries are absolutely breathtaking, but also because the way they manage all these visitor codes of conduct and information boards and interpretation boards from the local councils. And I forgot to mention that, Stanislav, the local councils are very much involved, of course, with those management and the areas. Is very well made. So they welcome a very high number of tourists, but they also provide a lot of information ahead of the trips. They work with a range of organizations. So for example, in Scotland, they work with the National Trust of Scotland. They work with Historic Scotland. They work with Visit Scotland, main destination management organization. And there is a very good synergy of information between all these organizations, and they're all doing different things. So the National Trust of Scotland is making sure that some of the best living heritage sites are there. Historic Scotland is more about the discovery of ruins of castles, for example. And then Visit Scotland is making sure that those national reserves have proper visitor center there, and it's managed by them. And when you enter those visitor centers, you have souvenirs and all these things, but you have a very simple and effective way of conveying information about fauna and flora, about the history of the place, about how these national parks have been created. So a little bit of history of the place alongside, and it started in really in the 19th century in Scotland, when tourism was, reserves was more exclusive, was just for a certain category of, as I said, in a bit of a exclusive for wealthy people, and then it became accessible by everyone. But what you see now is a lot of schools going there, a lot of people who love going into the wilds and explore and participate in those protection of birds, of sea life, of unique trees and wilderness areas. And I have to say that between Kazakhstan or New Zealand or Scotland or even France, the way it's been done, the most effective is Scotland, really, what I've said, and the whole of the United Kingdom. So my best national parks, to answer your question, is Loch Lomond National Park and the Cairngorms in Scotland.
Thank you for your answer.
What about you guys? What are your best? Sorry, Anastasia. What are your best national parks that you like?
I like to Pechora Ilich Nature Reserve in Komi Republic in Russia. It's a wonderful place. It's a plateau Manpupunir. Maybe you know.
Which one again? Sorry, I didn't hear very well.
Pechora Ilich Nature Reserve. It's Komi Republic in Russia.
I haven't been there, no.
And it's a place, Plata Manpupunira.
I haven't been there either. No.
You don't know?
I heard about them, but I have never been there. Okay. Anastasia, you had a question.
Yeah, I just after the question of Daria, I just was curious, like, what were the best promotional ideas, maybe things that nature reserves did to attract people that you've ever heard about or seen or remember?
Again, in Scotland, I think what they're doing really, really well is involving children. Because if you think about it, our generation, I mean, my generation, I consider myself as already slightly old, belonging to not the youngest ones, but children are the generation that will be involved with this sustainability, and yourself, of course. So they've got what they call discovery trails for children. So they have very like interactive games when children are involved in, finding a specific tree, a specific animal. And every time they do this, they have questions, and then, they can go online and get rewards. And really all these organizations that I mentioned, National Trust of Scotland, Historic Scotland, are doing this. And sometimes they have local events. So with countryside rangers or site rangers that are really involved in explaining all of that in much more detail with guided tours. And that's what I mentioned before. At some stage when you're a visitor, what you're looking for is not, if you're really interested into the nature, you want detailed information. You don't want to be part of a tour with 50 people and get the same, I would say, usual information. What you want to have is a dedicated ranger or site manager giving you the very specific type of information that you're looking for. So in Scotland, they hire very, very knowledgeable people there. And as I said, they are most of the time scientists. They're not marketologues, they're not tourism experts. They are scientists working for tourism in partnership with local communities who live there and who know what's going on. And then it's marketed by Visit Scotland and by different destination management organizations, but it's never the other way around. And it's when you've got the other way around, when you've got people who say, that's what we're gonna market, that's when it's going wrong. What you need to do is really get those local stakeholders together, those scientists, local communities, and say, okay, what is the knowledge that we can advertise? What is the uniqueness? And then having this marketing layers. But if you put marketing first, it never works. It works if you if you sell products, but not if you're selling a place. A place is a much more complex type of, that involves different products, different heritage aspects, different nature aspects. So you need to take into account all of this.
Thank you.
Anything else?
I guess on that episode, probably all questions were pronounced. Dear students, maybe you have some other questions? I guess not. not yet.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think it's a fascinating topic because, you know, and when you're looking at impacts of tourism, when you know I was about to talk about this a little bit more. You know, I'm just going to show one or two very quickly, one or two slides. It's okay. So, you know, when you've got a site like this, which is an archaeological place, your question, Stanislas, is very good, because how many people do you think can go into this place? If you've got hundreds of people, like it was the case in Peru, for, you know, this amazing site that they have in Peru, on the next to the Lake Titicaca, that you can't put hundreds of people there. So at some stage, you need to have an on-site evaluation and impact evaluation about how many people can be there. Because if we're looking at, you know, islands, okay, between this and this, who is involved really into, the government will give the license to build hotels and facilities, okay, with different levels of council and local council in particular, okay. So what is really important to do is, when you are this development stage, but actually even these two stages here, is to make sure that the pressure of hospitality doesn't overtake the environmental assets that you have on the ground. And to do that, it's, as I said, influence on conservation, but also influence on attitude change. Because never forget that the pressure comes from those private stakeholders, but it comes from also the tourist, okay? Because tourists want to more and more access those unique areas, and some of them are ready to pay a lot of money for that. So how can you make sure that you don't have a 5-star hotel that is built in the middle of nowhere? You know, very recently, there was a lot of discussion again in a beautiful region of Kazakhstan where they want to build a 5-star hotel. You know, and that's really the last thing to do. But it's a worldwide problem. So how can you make sure that the hotel they're building there, if they want to build a hotel, has an eco-certification scheme that ensures that all what they're doing, recycling, waste management, visitor management, is made appropriately on the ground. The way it's done here in Scotland, the way it's done in New Zealand, for most sites that they have that are run by Department of Conservation, or that are run by the National Trust of Scotland or the National Reserves. And that's really the key question now. You know, it's almost not favoring private projects, but having a collaborative approach to put the interest of the environment first, rather than private direct interest. And it's going back to what we were discussing with Ekaterina. The vision comes from that first. The short-term vision is never good. It's especially when it leads to direct financial benefits for some people.
Thank you very much. Dear students, maybe you have some other questions you would like to ask.
Please don't be shy. I mean, it's our last time, so.
Yeah, last meeting today. I mean, in our New Year's plans. But we hope to see you in autumn.
Yes,
At least online.
I will be involved in the conference, hopefully, and I can dig a little bit more on the question of authenticity, because my research interest really is on the visitor experience in relation to authenticity. But behind this question is really, for me, the question of, you know, in ecotourism, how you can maximize your experience with the environment. And in the environment, I mean, I include local people, local culture, local fauna and flora. And when I did my research, for example, on ecotourism in Kazakhstan around what we call yurt tourism in the steppe landscapes, I only made, you know, only about 75 interviews with different tourism stakeholders, including visitors, of course.
Fantastic, 75 interviews. And the longest, how much time it took you to make the interview?
It was between half an hour and 2 hours.
Yeah.
And I interviewed about 35 different tourists for two different tours. And the level of data that I gathered was fantastic, because a lot of themes emerged, you know, and that led all my research then after, and all this lecture that I just, you know, detailed for you. Because, you know, if you look at ecotourism, there's a very fine balance between, for example, level of comforts and, you know, level of people you can accommodate. So the tourists I interviewed were sleeping in yurts, and these yurts were not. I can show you very quickly in a couple of pictures of what I really mean here. These yurts were not made for the local people. They were, so one were made, but the other ones were completely fabricated.
For tourists. For tourists, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. And
like imitation.
Yeah, exactly. I can show you very quickly one example, and it's something that I will talk about in much more detail in October. But 1 second, I'm looking for, yes, yeah. So okay, I'm going to share it now. So this is the one I mentioned here. So can you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you see, these yurts are Chinese. This is samovar, you know that very well. So this yurt here is the kitchen. This yurt here is an additional yurt that is put with beds inside. So, and this is the steppe landscape. So this is an area that is usually never used for tourism. But the local stakeholders said, okay, we're going to imagine putting a yurt camp in the middle of nowhere, even if it's Chinese yurt, just because we think that the tourists will have a feeling of nomadic, you know, sense of nomadic authenticity, what I called. But in this group of tourists that I interviewed, they were around 25, and 25 to 30 actually. And in this group, there were old people up to 80 years old, believe it or not, a group of German tourists, and a mixture of people who were working in Kazakhstan, who were expatriates. Some of them were coming from Berlin because they heard about this tour and they were intrigued by it. You had a very few local tourists, so mostly international. And in the group of older tourists, international tourists, they were anthropologue, so people who had studied anthropology. And, you know, my very first question was, what do you think about this tour, and what is your perception of authenticity of this tour? And this, of course, that German anthropologue said, well, this is really not authentic to me, because, of course, I've read a lot about the nomadic culture, and I know these people were not living like that, okay? They were, I know that this area was never used in the past, etc., etc. Whereas another German tourist that was coming from Berlin the day before and the day after she found herself in this yurt, for her, everything was authentic, everything was great, because she knew nothing about the nomadic culture. So you see, that's precisely what the work is all about in ecotourism. The work is about understanding what tourists are looking for, you know, and it's not understanding that in, you know, how much price are you willing to pay? That's the classic questions. The more interesting questions for me are in-depth, open-ended questions, okay? So what are your expectations of the place? You know, what is your understanding of that particular part of the culture? So that people, depending on what people answer, then you can aggregate themes. And you can say, well, actually, most of my interviewees said I was interested by this or by that. So then you've got a trend, you've got a tendency, and then you can work with this trend. You can say, okay, so for example, in my work, I understood very quickly that for most of these visitors, the most important thing to come to Kazakhstan was to get back to simple things. And that was a data that wouldn't emerge in no quantitative type of research. They had traveled the world, for some of them, and they were telling me, Guillaume, it's really great because what we come to find here is simple things. You know, we can sit around a fire in the middle of nowhere. We're getting introduced to nomadic culture because the meals that were served were horse meat, horse milk, typical nomadic foods, if I may say so. But what they enjoyed even more was to talk to the local people and exchange with them, what I called in my research, creative reciprocity. And because in most countries, the problem when you've got hundreds of people coming is the local people are not interested to find out what the tourists have to say, because there are too many of them. And I think in Russia, you've got the same golden USP. You don't have a lot of tourists, especially in those areas, international ones in particular. So every time you have some, you're really interested about them. You want to know more about them. And that is something really rare nowadays. Believe me, in New Zealand, it's gone. Here, it's gone as well, because there are too many tourists. And that's personally what I really love about those areas, including, I'm sure, Perm District, because I'm sure you've got very interesting festivals and local culture that you want to show and display and share. And that is this sharing thing that makes it really interesting as a tourism experience to me. It's the fact that you not only witness, but you can be part of it, you can be involved. You know, there's a real exchange happening there beyond what we call the transactional exchange. So I pay money, I get a service, and that's it. But that is possible if you have, you know, not a small number, but a number of tourists that is workable. And again, back to carrying capacities. If in this guest house, or if in this yurt you put 50 of them, so when I interviewed the governmental officials, for example, just to give you that specific Chinese yurt that I showed you, there were only three or four no, yeah, 4 including the kitchen that I showed. But when I interviewed the governmental official, the guy specifically designed, elected and to develop ecotourism in Kazakhstan. He was telling me, oh, we're going to do 200 yurts on that lake because we have thousands of international tourists coming. And of course, there was no data to back this up. Now, put yourself in the shoes of those international tourists. Do you want to be with 1,000 of other international tourists there? No, you don't want that. Because the people who go to Kazakhstan to see even rare birds in this reserve that I showed you are coming to be, not to be mixed with hundreds of other people. They want to be into the wild with just a couple of tourists and have a real authentic tourism experience. So, and they're ready to pay a lot of money for that. That's the trick. So, you know, it's a fine line between balancing this and balancing other elements of your environment. So of course, every area is specific. And your area in Perm District might be very specific in terms of assessing different tourism products and experiences, I'm sure. So anything else you would like to know or comment on?
I would like to thank you. Really, it was very interesting. Dear students, do you have some other questions maybe you would like to ask them? Please, if yes, you're welcome to do it. If you are shy and you are afraid to ask questions in English, you can pronounce them in Russian and we will translate them. Maybe someone would like to ask? Dilara, are you here? Dilara?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, I just want to ask
Good
you.
evening.
Yes, good evening. There were so many interesting examples about Kazakhstan. Maybe you would like to comment something, yes. So, or because Dilara is from Kazakhstan, she lives there. Yeah, maybe you would like to give us some comments, or I don't know, some box.
I don't have any comments because I think all information was good, and it doesn't matter. And doesn't need to say something more. Thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting. It wasn't very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, Dilia, you know, again, you know, I really, really love Kazakhstan. So a lot of my comments here is really coming from the research I did. I did several projects there, but now you've got a new entity. So it's really interesting to see how the government is moving forward, because they have created a new agency called Kazakhstan Tourism, Kazakh Tourism. And it's a, if you wish, it's a subsidy, a DMO, like Visit Scotland here. It's called Kazakh Tourism there, responsible for the marketing of this. And I'm in direct contact with all of the stakeholders there, the, you know, director, vice director, and so on. And what I'm really happy about is that they are now seriously considering developing ecotourism and sustainable tourism in Kazakhstan. Not developing the 200 yurt camps on the Balkhash Lake, but developing ecotourism in the proper way, you know, consulting local communities, consulting experts and scientists, you know, not the top-down approach anymore, but really what we call the bottom-up approach. And it was really nice to see, because I did my research 10 years ago, to see 10 years onwards, you know, and it took 10 years to reach that stage. Can you imagine? That finally the government is understanding that people will come if they have a great experience And a great experience means that you need to have experts being involved into what they're doing. You can't just say, we're going to put a yurt on Balkhash, put people in there and serve them besparmak. You need really, besparmak is the national dish in Kazakhstan. So you need much more than that. You need guides, trained guides in both languages who are able to explain all the local traditions very precisely, who are able to translate what the tourists are saying for the local people and vice versa. So there's a lot of management considerations to make to achieve the standards, the international standards that international tourists are looking for. And that's what is at stake now for post-Soviet Union countries. If they want to attract people, especially with COVID now, like if you take Kazakhstan, you need now to wait until next year, unless you have a special reason to go to Kazakhstan, you can't go with COVID. So the tourism industry is dead, basically. That's another thing, unfortunately. I don't know what is the situation in Russia, but this is, I think, another dry year, and that's another topic by itself.
In Russia, the situation is a little bit different. For example, the previous week, the rules for the foreigners were changed, and even for the foreigners coming from Britain a little bit. And speaking about not foreign tourism, but inner tourism, we see that regional tourism. We see but the amount of tours that are sold increases. I mean, in general, especially taking into account ecological tours. Honestly, just we feel it, and the demands increase greatly. For example, right now it's the end of May, and in some companies there is a serious problem to find some guides for the middle of July or for the end of July. Because the tours were, let us say, that were asked for in February or in March. So there are not many guides for free in July or at the end of June, for example. And I mean, we feel it in active and ecological tourism, and the situation is a little bit different. Not many foreigners, truly, but still. And you know, there is another interesting moment that we noticed: the development of infrastructure in national parks also can be noted. For example, as I've told you, we have just returned from some national parks and national reserved parks and so on. And I've been there in September and in October. And the difference is great because we see that the tourist paths are made much better. For example, the bridges are constructed in a better way. Some special benches are made for tourists, some special tents for the tourists, and so on. The things that we really needed before. I mean, the development of the infrastructure as well is a very pleasant moment for us.
Yeah, well, exactly. And all of this takes time. And all of this is depending on the number of people who can come and access the area. Yeah. I know in Scotland that this summer is going to be like last summer, a problem, because last summer, because of COVID, everyone wanted to pitch a tent, go to national parks, and the amount of garbage and litter that was left was very problematic. So I know this year at the level of the national government, they're having this discussion about how these can be better managed this year from last year.
Yeah, and we also noticed that some special cans for waste are put on the routes, on the tourist routes. We really needed them before. I mean, just there was a serious problem with that. Yeah. So much more opportunity to take care of the place than before.
Yeah.
And even the separation of the waste is being introduced. Of course, it's not in all national reserved parks, but still, again, there is a trend towards the separation of the waste, for the division of the waste. And it's also very important for many people.
Yeah, exactly, especially for the local communities that,
Exactly.
that are living there. So, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I think we can stop here. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much for your very interesting lectures. It was just wonderful experience for us, for students, the opportunity to listen to some conceptions, to some other ways of thinking, and to see the new vision of the tourist problems. We really appreciate your lectures, and we sincerely thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you. Спасибо большое.
Dear student, do you want to say something more? Maybe some comments or questions, if you have some? Anyone?
Yes, I have a question connected with the statistics of global ecotourism. So where can we find the reliable one, and how is it different from the statistics of a usual tourism?
Well, for statistics, that's a very good question. I mean, in the UK, we've got, of course, governmental websites that can give you different data from the Ministry of Tourism. And in New Zealand, it's the same. And in Kazakhstan, they also have governmental statistics. Now, my experience with governmental statistics, for example, in Kazakhstan, is a huge discrepancy between official numbers and real numbers. And so the official numbers, they're talking about millions. Mm-hmm. But when you talk with the different local NGOs and national parks and the real figures, it's the difference is huge.
How can we understand the real situation? I mean,
well, you can't. In Kazakhstan, that's a problem. Personally, I trust the data from the local areas more. But to specifically assess who is an ecotourist, that's quite difficult, Maria, because you need to access the data from the local sites, not from the national or international. So for example, a local museum will tell you how many visitors they have every year. When I did my research on specifically on dark tourism in Kazakhstan, we asked specifically from the museums the data of how many tourists they had per year. And to give you an example, those museums had around 15,000 people every year, whereas the government was talking about several hundreds of thousands. So, I always trust the local data much more. Not in countries like New Zealand and the UK, where the ministry is really monitoring seriously the visitor numbers from various forms of calculations. But also, I know when you've got a visa system in Russia, they could tell you how many international visitors they had, and same in Kazakhstan. That's okay from the number of international, entrants in the country and visas they had. So they monitor this quite closely, so they can tell you how many people came from this country or that country. But specifically for ecotourism, you will need to cross data, and you will need, I think, to ask more specific local areas for that.
Thank you. Okay, maybe some more questions. Okay. Yeah, I guess no more questions left.
Okay. So good luck with your studies.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I think you're having a great project and a great program, and it's very great that you can manage to do a field trip, you know, because in the UK we can't do that anymore because of COVID.
Yeah.
So we've got risk assessments in place and we can't do any field trips. I used to take my students as well, and I wasn't able to do that for almost a year and a half now. So I'm really hoping we can do that again. Yeah.
Yeah, let's hope for the best. And the trip was really fantastic. I mean, we managed to visit a lot of ecological routes and national reserve parks and everything. And it's a very interesting experience. And also it was a great experience to listen to your lectures, and particularly thank you for changing the topic of one of the lecture to speak more about ecological tourism, in which we're so particularly interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Дорогие студенты, может, какие-то вопросы, еще комментарии, что-то завершающее у нас сегодня встреча? I'm so sorry that I'm without video. The internet connection is not good in my site.
That's okay. That's fine.
Please, dear students, any comments, any final words, anything of that sort? Okay, then just we would like to thank you.
Okay, everyone, thank you very much, and see you maybe in October.
Yes, we hope to see you, maybe offline, if everything will be good enough.
Хорошо. Я надеюсь. Посмотрим.
Да, надеемся тоже. До встречи уже в Перми.
Okay.
Спасибо большое.
До свидания.
До свидания. Спасибо.
До свидания.
До свидания, спасибо.
До свидания, всего доброго.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.